Clara Martinez had grown up with jet fuel in her veins. Her small Arizona hometown sat just outside Nellis Air Force Base, where the sky was constantly carved by white contrails and the thunder of afterburners. While other kids complained about the noise, Clara would stand in her backyard, neck craned skyward, watching F-16s slice through the desert air like silver arrows. By 18, she'd already logged more flight hours than most college graduates. Working 2 jobs, one at a diner, another stocking shelves, she scraped together every dollar for flight school. Her instructors at the local airfield shook their heads in amazement. The girl had something special, an intuitive understanding of aircraft that couldn't be taught. She didn't just fly planes, she became one with them. When the acceptance letter arrived from the Air Force's elite pilot training program at Edwards, Clara's hands trembled as she read it. This was it, her shot at the big leagues, at flying the most advanced fighters in the world. She'd be one of only 20 candidates selected from thousands of applicants. The program's reputation preceded it. Commander David Hayes, a former Top Gun instructor with 30 years of service, ran the camp with military precision. His philosophy was simple: only the absolute best would earn their wings. Failure rates hovered around 60%, and washouts were swift and final. Clara arrived at Edwards on a scorching July morning, her single duffel bag containing everything she owned. The other 19 candidates were already there, all men, all confident, all sizing each other up like prize fighters. She caught the sideways glances, the barely concealed smirks when she introduced herself. During orientation, Commander Hayes addressed the group in a hangar filled with training aircraft. His steel-grey eyes swept over each candidate before settling briefly on Clara. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in cockpits, "this program will test every fiber of your being. We don't need cowboys or show-offs. We need pilots who follow orders, maintain composure under pressure, and fit seamlessly into our elite fighting force." The emphasis on certain words wasn't lost on Clara. As Hayes outlined the grueling months ahead, dawn to dusk training, psychological evaluations, high-G maneuvers that would push human limits, she noticed how his gaze kept returning to her, calculating and skeptical. That first night in the barracks, Clara lay awake listening to her fellow candidates swap stories about their fathers and grandfathers who'd served, about family legacies of military aviation. She had no such legacy, just an unwavering dream and the skill to back it up. But already she could feel the weight of expectation. Not that she would succeed, but that she would prove their doubts right. The first real test came during week 3, aerial combat maneuvering in T-38 Talons. Clara had been waiting for this moment, the chance to show what she could really do in the air. The exercise was simple: defensive flying against an aggressor aircraft, maintain situational awareness, avoid getting shot down by the instructor pilot. Clara's turn came after lunch. She strapped into the cockpit with Lieutenant Sarah Kim, one of the few female instructors on base. The irony wasn't lost on her. At least someone understood what it felt like to be the only woman in a room full of skeptical men. The aggressor pilot was relentless, diving and climbing in attack patterns, designed to disorient student pilots, but Clara felt completely at home. She rolled inverted, pulled hard G-forces that would have made her classmates grey out, and executed a perfect barrel roll that put her directly behind her attacker. The radio crackled with Kim's excited voice. "Outstanding maneuvering, Martinez." "Textbook flying!" When they landed, Clara felt the familiar rush of adrenaline and satisfaction. She'd flown perfectly, better than any of the other candidates that day. As she climbed down from the aircraft, she caught sight of Commander Hayes, standing by the hangar, clipboard in hand, watching her with an unreadable expression. The debrief should have been a celebration. Instead, Hayes stood before the assembled candidates with a stern expression. "Martinez!" he called out, his voice cutting through the humid afternoon air. "That was some fancy flying up there." Clara straightened, unsure if it was praise or criticism. "Thank you, sir."
"Too fancy," Hayes continued, his tone hardening. "This isn't an air show. We need pilots who follow procedures, not hotshots who think they can reinvent aerial combat. Your aggressive maneuvering was reckless and unprofessional." The words hit
Clara like a physical blow. She'd flown exactly as she'd been trained, exactly as the situation demanded. Around her, she could see her fellow candidates exchanging glances, some sympathetic, others relieved they weren't in the hot seat. "Sir, I maintained safety parameters throughout the exercise," Clara said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. Hayes's expression didn't change. "Are you questioning my assessment, Martinez?" The hangar fell silent. Clara realized this was a trap. Speak up and be labeled insubordinate, stay quiet and accept unfair criticism. Either way, she lost. "No, sir," she finally said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. As the weeks progressed, Clara found herself under constant scrutiny. Every maneuver was dissected, every decision questioned. When she flew conservatively, Hayes criticized her lack of assertiveness. When she pushed the envelope, she was reckless. Her fellow candidates began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone clearly marked for failure. The breaking point came during formation flying exercises. Clara had been assigned to fly wing position with Jake Thompson, a cocky pilot from Texas whose father was a retired Air Force general. Jake had a habit of making jokes about women pilots during briefings, always with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. During the exercise, Jake deliberately flew erratic patterns, making it nearly impossible for Clara to maintain proper formation. She compensated brilliantly, adjusting her position with split-second timing that showcased years of experience. But when they landed, Jake was already spinning the story. "She couldn't hold formation," he told Hayes during debrief, his voice carrying just the right mix of concern and disappointment.
"I had to constantly adjust my flight path to compensate for her positioning errors." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "That's not what happened, sir. Thompson was—" "Martinez," Hayes cut her off sharply. "Are you suggesting that Thompson is lying?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Clara looked around at her fellow candidates, searching for support, for someone who might have witnessed Jake's dangerous flying. She found only downcast eyes and studied silence.
They'd all seen what really happened, but none were willing to risk their own careers to defend her. Lieutenant Kim approached Clara after the debrief. As one of the few women on base, she understood the dynamics at play better than anyone. "You're flying better than half these guys," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "But Hayes has his mind made up. He's looking for any excuse." "What am I supposed to do?" Clara asked, the frustration finally showing in her voice. Kim's expression was sympathetic but resigned. "Keep your head down, fly perfect. Maybe you can
outlast his prejudice." But Clara was beginning to realize that perfection might not be enough.
The system wasn't designed to evaluate her fairly. It was designed to validate preconceived notions about who belonged in a fighter cockpit. The end came during a simulated emergency landing drill, the same exercise that had washed out 3 other candidates in previous weeks. Clara was assigned an F-16 simulator programmed with a catastrophic engine failure at 15,000 feet. The scenario was brutal: total power loss, limited time, and a narrow window to reach the designated emergency
airstrip.
Clara slipped into the zone she knew best. Time seemed to slow as she calculated glide ratios, wind patterns, and approach angles. She executed a perfect dead-stick landing, bringing the simulated aircraft down with textbook precision. The other candidates who watched the exercise were genuinely impressed. It was a masterful piece of flying under pressure. But when Clara emerged from the simulator, expecting at least grudging acknowledgement of her skill, she found Hayes waiting with a stone-cold expression. "Unacceptable," he announced to the assembled group. Martinez failed to follow proper emergency procedures. She deviated from established protocols and endangered the aircraft. Clara felt her world tilt. "Sir, I saved the aircraft. Every system was properly managed according to—" "Well, you improvised," Hayes cut her off. "In combat situations, we need pilots who follow procedures, not freelancers who think they know better than decades of Air Force experience." The injustice was so blatant that even some of her fellow candidates looked uncomfortable. Jake Thompson himself seemed surprised by the harsh assessment. But Clara realized that facts didn't matter anymore. Hayes had made his decision long before she ever entered that simulator. That evening, Clara was summoned to Hayes's office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she stood at attention. Before his desk, hands clasped behind her back. Hayes didn't look up from his paperwork for a full minute, letting the silence stretch like a taut wire. "You gave it a good shot, Martinez," he finally said, his voice carrying a tone of fake regret. "But this program isn't the right fit for everyone. We need team players who can integrate seamlessly into our operational framework." Clara's throat felt like sandpaper. "Sir, I respectfully request specific examples of how I failed to meet program standards." Hayes finally looked up, his expression cold and final. "Your discharge papers will be ready tomorrow morning. You'll be transported back to civilian status by 0800 hours. Walking back to the barracks that night, Clara felt something break inside her chest. Not her spirit, that remained intact, but her faith in the system she devoted her life to serving. She packed her single duffel bag in silence, while her former classmates pretended to sleep, the weight of unspoken sympathy heavy in the air. She'd given everything to earn her place in that cockpit, but it was never about her flying, it was about who they thought deserved to fly. 2 years later, Clara was teaching teenagers how to land Cessnas at a small airfield outside Phoenix. It wasn't the sky she'd dreamed of, but it was still flying. She'd made peace with her circumstances, or so she told herself during the long Arizona afternoons when fighter jets from nearby Luke Air Force Base would streak overhead, leaving her with a hollow ache in her chest. Everything changed when Miguel Rodriguez showed up at her hangar. They'd met briefly during her time at Edwards. He was a former Navy pilot turned private contractor who specialized in testing experimental aircraft systems. Miguel had watched Clara fly during training exercises and remembered her exceptional
skill. "You still the best pilot nobody's heard of?" he asked, leaning against her desk with a knowing smile. Clara looked up from her lesson plans, surprised to see him. "I'm just a flight instructor now, Miguel. Nothing special." "Bullshit," he said bluntly.
"I've been following your story. What happened at Edwards was criminal. Hayes is a dinosaur who can't see past his own prejudices." Miguel explained that he now worked for a classified program testing next-generation fighter systems, aircraft, so advanced that traditional military protocols couldn't keep up. They needed test pilots who could think outside conventional parameters, who could coax performance data from machines that didn't exist in any manual. "I need someone who can fly. By instinct, not checklist," Gell said. "Someone who's not bogged down by military politics or bruised egos. I've been authorized to recruit one civilian pilot for this program, and I want it to be you." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Miguel, I washed out of pilot training. Why would anyone trust me with experimental aircraft? Because,
I've seen what you can do in a cockpit, he replied seriously.
and because this program is run by people who care more about results than politics. We've got an F-22 variant that's been modified beyond anything the regular Air Force has ever seen. It needs a pilot who can handle the unknown. That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. The smart play was to stay safe, keep teaching, accept that her dreams of military aviation were over. But somewhere deep in her chest, the same fire that had driven her to Edwards was beginning to rekindle. 3 weeks later, after extensive background checks and psychological evaluations, Clara found herself at a classified facility in Nevada. The security clearance process had been grueling, but Miguel's recommendations carried weight in the Black Project community. Standing before a modified F-22 Raptor in an unmarked hangar, Clara felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just an F-22, it was something evolved, predatory, built for capabilities that existed at the edge of aerospace engineering. She's been stripped of conventional restrictions, the chief engineer explained. New avionics, experimental propulsion, enhanced maneuverability systems. The Air Force rejected her as too unpredictable for operational use. Clara smiled grimly. Sounds like we have something in common. For 18 months, Clara flew missions that didn't officially exist. She tested stealth capabilities over restricted airspace, pushed experimental engines to their limits, and gathered performance data that would influence the next generation of American air superiority. The modified F-22 responded to her touch. Like no aircraft she'd ever flown, it was as if the machine had been waiting for someone who understood its potential. Her reputation in the classified community grew quickly. Engineers marveled at the data she brought back from test flights that would have challenged pilots with decades more experience. She learned to navigate by instruments alone, operate in zero visibility, and handle G-forces that pushed human physiology to its limits. The opportunity for revenge came through Miguel, who maintained contacts throughout the Air Force. Edwards was planning a massive training exercise, a war game scenario designed to showcase the elite pilot program to Pentagon observers and defense contractors. The same program that had rejected Clara would be flying defensive patterns against simulated threats. They're calling it Operation Steel Eagle, Miguel explained over coffee in the facility's secure briefing room. Full media blackout, but every Air Force brass worth their stars will be watching. Hayes is running the show personally, once, to demonstrate how his program produces the world's finest fighter pilots. Clara felt something cold and calculating settle in her chest. What are you suggesting? The exercise parameters include provisions for unknown threats, aircraft that aren't part of the scheduled scenarios, keeps the defensive pilots on their toes, Miguel said carefully. We've been authorized to conduct a systems test during the same time frame. Officially, we'd be evaluating stealth penetration capabilities against current Air Force defensive protocols. Clara understood immediately. They could fly directly into the exercise zone, challenge the same pilots who'd once looked down on her, and see how Edwards' elite program performed against a real unknown threat. Miguel, that's not just testing systems, Clara said quietly. That's me flying directly into their exercise. That's you showing them what they threw away, Miguel corrected. The modified Raptor will be completely invisible to their radar.
Until you want them to see you. You could penetrate their entire defensive perimeter, reach the target zone, and be gone before they know what happened. Clara stared out the window at the desert landscape, her mind racing through the possibilities.
It was risky. If anything went wrong, her career in aerospace would be over permanently. But the thought of flying rings around the same system that had declared her unfit was intoxicating. When's the exercise? She asked. Miguel's grin told her everything she needed to know. 3 weeks from Tuesday. Dawn launch, full defensive. Scenario: Hayes will have his best pilots running combat air patrol patterns around Edwards. Clara nodded slowly, feeling the familiar fire building in her chest. Then I guess it's time to show them what too unpredictable really looks like. Dawn broke over Edwards Air Force Base as Operation Steel Eagle commenced. In the Tactical Operations Center, Commander Hayes watched radar displays showing his elite pilots executing perfect defensive patterns. F-16s and F-15s flew predetermined routes, protecting the simulated high-value target at the exercise's center. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. 50 miles away, Clara Martinez climbed into the modified F-22's cockpit for the most important flight of her life. The pre-flight checklist was muscle memory now, but her hands trembled slightly as she activated the experimental stealth systems that would make her aircraft nearly invisible to conventional radar. Phoenix, lead to control, requesting clearance for systems test flight, Clara transmitted on the encrypted channel. Phoenix lead, you are cleared for all planned test parameters. Happy hunting. Clara pushed the throttles forward and felt the Raptor's twin engines respond with a growl that vibrated through her bones. She lifted off into the golden morning sky, climbing rapidly toward 40,000 feet, well above the altitude ceiling of the exercise participants. The modified Raptor moved
through the air like a ghost.
Clara's radar warning receiver remained silent as she approached Edwards airspace. Below her, she could see the contrails of Hayes pilots running their defensive patterns, blissfully unaware of the threat approaching from above. Clara began her descent, using terrain masking and the aircraft's advanced stealth capabilities to penetrate the defensive perimeter. The same tactical instincts that Hayes had once criticized as undisciplined now allowed her to slip between radar sweeps like smoke through a net. In the operations center, the first indication of trouble came when radar operators noticed a brief, anomalous contact on their screens. There, 1 second, gone the next. "Sir, we're getting intermittent returns from Sector 7, a technician reported to Hayes. "Could be atmospheric interference." Hayes frowned at the display. The exercise was proceeding flawlessly. There shouldn't be any unidentified contacts. Run a diagnostic on that sector's radar array. Meanwhile, Clara was 15 miles from the target zone, flying nap of the earth through desert canyons that would make the Raptor nearly impossible to spot visually. Her pulse was steady, her mind clear. This was what she'd been born to do. She popped up from the canyon floor and activated the aircraft's targeting systems, painting the simulated target with laser designation. In that moment, she made herself visible to every radar screen in the exercise. Alarms began blaring in the operations center. "Unknown aircraft in the target zone," someone shouted. "How the hell did it get through?" Hayes stared at the radar display in disbelief. An aircraft had penetrated his supposedly impenetrable defensive screen and was now directly over the target they were meant to protect. "Scramble everything, I want that aircraft identified and intercepted." But Clara was
already gone, diving back into the terrain and disappearing from radar coverage.
The F-16s and F-15s scrambled to intercept, found nothing but empty sky. She had executed a perfect penetration mission, exactly the kind of tactical thinking that Hayes had once called unfit for military service. 20 minutes later, Clara touched down on a remote runway at Edwards's southern perimeter, the same area where rejected pilot candidates were processed out of the program. She shut down the Raptor's engines and sat in the cockpit for a moment, letting the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished settle over her. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the desert silence. A convoy of military vehicles raced toward her position, led by a staff car that Clara recognized immediately. Commander Hayes emerged from the passenger seat, his face a mixture of confusion, anger, and something that might have been respect. Clara climbed down from the aircraft, removing her helmet to reveal the face Hayes probably thought he'd never see again. She stood at attention, not out of military protocol, but because she was finally exactly where she belonged. "You really just penetrated the most advanced defensive screen in the Air Force," Hayes said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "in an aircraft that shouldn't even exist." "Yes, sir," Clara replied simply. There was no arrogance in her voice, no need to gloat. The flight had spoken for itself. Hayes walked around the modified F-22, examining the aircraft that had made his elite pilots look like student pilots.
"How?" he asked quietly. "The same way I always flew, sir. By trusting my instincts and adapting to the situation instead of strictly following predetermined patterns." The words hung in the desert air like an indictment. Hayes had dismissed exactly
the qualities that had just made Clara successful. The other officers who'd arrived with Hayes stood in uncomfortable silence, recognizing the implications of what they'd witnessed. "You proved your point, Martinez," Hayes said finally. "You're obviously an exceptional pilot." Clara shook her head. "I'm not here to prove anything to you, sir. I proved something to myself 3 years ago when you discharged me. I belonged."
"In that cockpit then, just like I belong in this one now?" She turned back toward the Raptor, where ground crew were already beginning their post-flight inspection.
The aircraft represented everything she'd fought for, the chance to fly at the edge of human capability, to push boundaries instead of staying safely within established parameters. Miguel appeared at her side, having driven out from the classified facility. "How'd it feel?" he asked quietly. Clara looked back at Edwards Air Force Base, at the institution that had once rejected her, then at the experimental aircraft that now bore her name on its pilot assignment sheet. She'd spent 3 years carrying the weight of their rejection, wondering if maybe they'd been right about her limitations. Now she knew the truth. She hadn't been wrong for their system. Their system had been wrong for her. "It felt like coming home," she said. As the sun climbed higher over the Mojave Desert, Clara Martinez walked away from the base that had once broken her heart, knowing that she'd never need their validation again. She had found her place in the sky, and no one could ever take that away from her again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.